At the height of his career, Phil Spector was considered a genius, whose work with the likes of John Lennon and the Beach Boys cemented his place in music history. But Spector also had a wicked temper and a dark side that would be woven through the final chapters of his erratic story. This is a killer soundtrack. There are those who remember Phil Spector as an intelligent and creative music producer, a man who worked with stars such as John Lennon, the Beatles, and the Ramones during the 1960s and 70s. He was the creator of the Wall of Sound, a production technique developed at Gold Star Studios in Los Angeles that delivered hit records and elevated Spector's star status. But to others, Spector was a violent megalomaniac whose single-mindedness exposed darker traits of his character. As his musical influence and the power of his creativity began to wane, Phil Spector, A-list celebrity and influential Hollywood figure, did the unthinkable.
Phil Spector had a reputation for drinking, having romantic interest, and then getting violent if that romantic interest was not responded or reciprocated to. But there were some huge names in the music industry who, by and large, said, we knew this was going to happen one of these days. He's been doing it too long, too often, with too many different people.
They're saying that he, stuck a gun in her mouth and blew her head off. But that's just not Phil. I never thought that he actually did it. At the very worst, they were playing some stupid game and something happened and the gun accidentally went off.
There's some critical evidence to this case. The question being, where were the two people in the gun at the time it discharged?
There was the early Phil Spector, then there was the later Phil Spector. I don't know what things had occurred in his life or his mind later on that really sent him in a different direction, but he always struck me as somebody who was kind of lonely.
Phil Spector's musical talent was evident as far back as 1958, when To Know Him Is to Love Him, a song he had written for his band The Teddy Bears, went to #1 on the US Billboard charts. When the band broke up the following year, Spector turned to song production and found a new outlet for his undoubted talents. In the 1960s, he wrote and produced a string of singles for various artists, such as the Ronettes, the Crystals, and the Righteous Brothers, that soared up the charts. Spector, often utilizing the skills of a group of session musicians who would later become known as the Wrecking Crew, was at home in the studio where he kept a tight grip on the production process. Kent Hartman is an expert on the Wrecking Crew and dedicated years of his life to studying their musical nuances and rock and roll tales. In his best-selling book, The Wrecking Crew, Hartman delves into the lives of those whose dedication to their craft became legendary.
The Phil Spector of the early 1960s was truly a visionary in the music business. Phil Spector, I think, saw a need. As any great entrepreneur does, they see there's something lacking in the marketplace that they think they could fill.
Influenced by German composer Wilhelm Wagner, whose opera compositions were complex and orchestral, Spector developed an approach to music that involved heavily layering sounds in the recording process to produce a dense finished product. The songs sounded thicker and heavier on the radios and jukeboxes of the era and were hugely popular. The technique would become known as the Wall of Sound.
The Wrecking Crew was a group of studio musicians. Some would argue there were 15, some would say there's 25. There is no exact number, but it's a fairly small number. But they were the best of the best in LA or in Hollywood that could play rock and roll in the early 60s. The method to his madness was that he had all of these people play live at once. So there was this cacophony of sounds. And he would have to sort of mix it on the fly, and then it would all go on to tape from there. And so that's what made Phil Spector unique. No one had done that before. You know, it was rock and roll and Wagner put together.
Michel Rubini was working as a session musician in Los Angeles when he met Phil Spector for the first time in the 1960s.
It was really amazing. I was very nervous. It was very intense, although it was only intense for me. Everybody else was just having a good time, but it was my first date, you know? And in my mind, I hadn't really arrived, you know, I hadn't reached the pinnacle of my career if I hadn't played on the Spector session.
Rubini, a classically trained pianist, was asked to play on the Spector-produced Be My Baby by the Ronettes, and the song was a hit, reaching #2 in the American charts.
Be My Baby by the Ronettes. So I'd be playing here, and the other piano player would be like going, and the harpsichord will be in the middle going, and all that added together starts in just becoming this huge wash of sound.
The pianist and Spector developed a friendship and understanding that would flourish. Rubini was more than just a session musician. He was inquisitive, carefully watching Spector to understand his methods. And he asked questions that impressed Spector, who sometimes would respond with a dry sense of humor that assisted in developing a chemistry between the pair.
For about a 4-year period, I would say from 62 to 66, that was his signature sound, and he had hit after hit after hit after hit with that until tastes began changing and he didn't keep up with the changing tastes.
By the mid-1960s, music had started to change, and the songs were more likely to reflect on life's hard reality. But with the 1966 song, River Deep, Mountain High, Spector thought he had a hit bigger than anything he had produced before.
And as far as all the musicians in the room felt, we thought it was a stone hit. I mean, there was just no doubt that this was going to be #1 Grammy Song of the Year.
Then the song comes out a few months later and it just tanks. It got no higher than number 88 in the US. By far the worst showing. Phil Spector was crushed, and many of the Wrecking Crew were stunned because when they heard it on the radio, it didn't sound anything like what they had done in the studio.
In an attempt to get back on track, Spector returned to the studio with the Wrecking Crew to work on another song. But the sense of humor and the lighthearted joke-cracking had gone. After several attempts to arrange the composition and without recording it, Spector called an end to the session, and the musicians packed away their instruments and left. Michel Rubini was the last to leave, but before he did, he looked across to Spector, who was sitting in the corner of the control room, staring into space. Rubini asked Spector if he was okay, but there was no response.
Then I asked again, and he looked at me like sort of coming out of a trance, and he said, "Oh no, Rubini, everything's fine, everything's fine." I said, is there anything I can do? He went, no. And then he just started staring into space again. I thought to myself, this is really bad. Something's not right here. And sure enough, something wasn't right. He had a nervous breakdown. He couldn't take it.
He loved being the king. He was the king of the music business for some time, and I've worked with a lot of musicians over the years, and once you get a taste of that, at least for some people, it's very hard to accept not having that.
Spector's self-confidence had been crushed, and for the next few years, he kept a low profile before the Beatles came calling in March 1970. Beatles lead singer John Lennon and guitarist George Harrison had first met Spector at a party in 1964. 6 years later, with their Get Back sessions having stalled, Spector was brought in to remix the songs, which were released as the Let It Be album. Lennon and Harrison would again call on Spector's influence for solo projects, including Lennon's ubiquitous Imagine.
But by then, Phil Spector was a bit of a different guy. The lack of personal success from '66 on, I think, had somewhat damaged him. He was a darker character, I think. He wasn't as open to things. He was happy to produce, but whatever forces were in his life were starting to take more of a toll on him.
Spector's increasingly erratic behavior was typified on one particular occasion, when Wrecking Crew member Mike Melvoin challenged him over pay during a John Lennon session. The band had been playing for hours, and when Melvoin pointed out to Spector that overtime rates should apply, it did not go down well. Spector instead suggested starting the session anew to avoid paying penalty rates. And when Melvoin expressed his displeasure, Spector exploded in a rage, and the pianist was removed from the session.
That was a big clue as to where things were going. And so what I've been told by the guys in the Wrecking Crew is that the next evening they're back, they're doing their thing, and by then Phil's actually drinking in the studio some, which he had never done before. The following evening, my understanding is that he then fired off a gun into the ceiling in the control booth, or the control room, which shocked everybody. And so they knew then that things were different. Phil had like 2 hulking bodyguards with him. You know, there was this gun now. Phil was drinking a lot. The old days were over. You know, Phil, to I think a lot of their views, was evolving into a different, darker person by then. And then we all know what happened later on.
There was story after story, Phil Spector inviting people to his house. He would not come down. He had these massive houses, one in Pasadena, one in Alhambra. He wouldn't come down from the upstairs. And he had these automatic locks on the house or on the home and would lock up all the windows and the doors. So the guests literally could not leave, and they would be held captive for hours and hours and hours at a time. Some people suggested that they were held captive for days at a time. Some of those stories stretch the imagination, and you wonder about the veracity of the stories, but there were so many of them. Again, they were just repeated with such vigor that one has to start believing, oh yeah, that must have happened. That was his reputation. People were deathly afraid of Phil Spector because I think he was such a megalomaniac that he was not afraid to do anything to anybody and use violence to get his way.
I wouldn't go so far as to say violent or aggressive. He could certainly get mad. He could be frustrated and get mad, and I did witness that back in the 70s. He was producing John Lennon over at A&M Records in their studios in Hollywood, and at that particular time, I was under contract to Motown, and I had made an album, and I was mastering that album at the mastering studios at A&M.
Another talented musician, Joni Mitchell, was mastering her 1974 album Caught and Spark at the time, and she and Rubini struck up a conversation. When Mitchell suggested they both go into an adjacent studio to watch Spector work, Rubini agreed. What he saw was a frustrated and apparently intoxicated Spector, who had no time for the input of others. A polite suggestion from Mitchell regarding the arrangement of a song was met with a sharp and ferocious response.
And the minute she said that, he whipped around at her and looked at her, and it looked like daggers was coming out of his eyeballs. And he looked at her and he said, "Get the fuck out of my studio now," you know. I looked in and I was just, what did he just say? What did you just say, you know? But Joni seemed to just take it all in stride. I mean, she wasn't shocked at all. And she said, "Come on, Michelle, let's go." And I said, "Okay." I said to her, "Joni, I am so sorry. I'm embarrassed for Phil. I don't know what's happened to him, and I'm just so sorry." And she said, "Michelle," she said, no, she said, "Don't worry about it. He kicks me out of the studio every night. She had been going into the studio every night, and every night he would kick her out of the studio. So for her, it was just another night.
It was also just another example of Phil Spector's increasingly irrational behavior and the slow decline of his musical influence. But in 1992, in an attempt to revitalize his career, he called members of the Wrecking Crew into the studio to record with him. But the studio had not been prepared for a Phil Spector session, and his enthusiasm turned to frustration and eventually disappointment. The session was aborted, and so too was Spector's comeback.
I didn't know if I would ever see Phil again, after this disaster of a session. A couple of weeks later, I got a check in the mail from Phil for the session. I looked at the check and I thought to myself, I'm not going to cash this check. The session was a total disaster for him, and I don't need the money, and I'm going to send it back to him. I sent the check back with a note saying that I didn't want to cash the check because it was the least I could do. And then a week later or so, I got an envelope in the mail from Phil with the check. He signed the check and he wrote a special thank you to me.
In the mind of Michelle Rubini, that now framed check symbolizes the end of Phil Spector, musical genius. But the story of the Hollywood record producer had a much darker chapter to follow. By 2003, having slipped out of the musical spotlight, Phil Spector unleashed his now infamous temper on actress and model Lana Clarkson. Spector was already intoxicated after a night of drinking when his chauffeur, Adriano D'Souza, drove him to the House of Blues, where Clarkson was working in the club's VIP area.
When he walked up to the VIP room at the House of Blues, ultimately she had no idea who he was. And her first words were, "I'm sorry, ma'am, you can't come in here." That was the wrong thing to say to Phil Spector. She did not know who he was, and someone quickly rushed over to usher him in, someone who did recognize him, and explained very quickly to Lana, "Do you have any idea who that guy is?" That's Phil Spector. He built the Wall of Sound. He's very famous in the music industry. He's very famous in Hollywood. He's clearly a VIP.
After initially mistaking Spector for a woman, Lana Clarkson was determined to make amends for her error and made sure special attention was paid to the guest. But Spector wanted more. And after initially rejecting his request for her to join him at his mansion in Alhambra, Clarkson agreed to go for one drink only.
Ultimately, she finally succumbed. She said, "Okay, if we go back to your place for one drink, that's fine. I can have one drink, and that's it." She ultimately gets in the limousine and heads back to his mansion in Alhambra.
Spector's chauffeur, Adriano D'Souza, drove the pair to the mansion and parked in a courtyard outside.
They went in the back door and apparently, according to the evidence that we ultimately had and gathered, had several more drinks, some tequila. So by the time that he ultimately ends up in the house with Lana Clarkson, he's had something like 10, 12, 14 ounces of alcohol throughout the night. At some point after a couple of hours, the limousine driver is sitting outside waiting. He hears a crack. Very, very early in the morning, maybe 5 o'clock in the morning. He thought maybe a tree branch had snapped. So he got out of the Mercedes and he literally walked around the Mercedes about 360 degrees. And just as he started to walk back over toward the driver's side door, the back door creaked open. He looked up and just a few feet away, he sees Phil Spector standing there. He's got a gun by his side and he looks at Adriano D'Souza and he says, "I think I killed somebody." And then he backed up and walked back in the house. As he did, Adriano D'Souza could see just past him, and what he saw was Lana Clarkson sitting in a chair, her feet out in front of her, with her head lolled to one side. So he immediately called the police, and he repeated to the police officer exactly what he had just heard seconds earlier, which was, I think my boss killed somebody, I think my boss shot somebody. The police then arrived and ultimately took Phil Spector into custody and found Lana Clarkson having been shot through the mouth.
Over the course of preparing a prosecution case against Phil Spector for the February 2003 murder of Lana Clarkson, experienced criminal lawyer Alan Jackson had learned that such outbursts were not uncommon. Jackson, who has worked in criminal law for more than 20 years, pieced together a picture of Spector that was instrumental in the case against the music producer.
Murder cases on their own they're different animals. You're dealing with someone by definition. You're defending the rights of someone. You're giving a voice to someone. You're building flesh and bone in your storytelling for someone whom you've never met. And you're also dealing with family members who've lost someone, and it's the most devastating thing you can imagine. I mean, a murder case, by definition, is going to leave a wake of other victims behind. When we presented this case before the trial to the judge in an effort to get a ruling on what we could use in evidence in the trial, one of the things that we presented was a full panoply of what he's been doing throughout his life, all the way from the 70s through the 80s to the 90s to the 2000s in terms of violence, using guns to intimidate human beings. His particularized form of a tantrum was to pull a gun and stick it in someone's face. When someone bucked what he wanted to do or what he wanted to say or his opinion about anything, he was very quick to reach for that pistol, reach for that gun, and stick it in your face. Usually loaded, always unsafe, always with an eye toward intimidating someone. And that's exactly what he did on the night in question.
The scene was set for a celebrity trial that gripped America.
I think people just looked at this case more with just a generalized fascination, trying to figure out kind of how it's going to go, rather than jumping on board on one side or the other. You didn't have to sort of sit around and think about the drama of that case. The drama was built into that case. The people involved, Phil Spector on his side, Lana Clarkson on her side, the individuals, the witnesses that were involved, it was built for the drama of a closing argument. That's not something that you had to sort of make up. Closing argument there's nothing like it. It's an adrenaline rush. It's when everything in a case comes together. Opening statement, closing arguments. That's the only time you get to interact one-on-one with a jury and really build that sort of that courtship, if you will. There's nothing like it. If you're a lawyer and you haven't given a closing argument, you're missing something in the practice of law.
It was the first time I had encountered a trial that had been filmed, and it changed the whole dynamic of the courtroom. It influenced where you could be, what you could say. I was standing at the podium talking to one of the attorneys when we realized that there was a microphone there, that it was being heard. Normally you have an ability to stand and talk to the attorneys and have an expectation that that conversation is limited.
I felt unbelievably passionate about what we were doing as a prosecution team. I felt incredibly passionate on behalf of Lana Clarkson. And I know for their part, the defense felt very passionate about what they were doing as well. So there was a lot of very intense theater in the Phil Spector case, no question.
On Spector's first trial, Dr. Lynn Harold, a senior criminalist in the Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department, provided the trace evidence analysis, including painting a picture of what the bloodstain patterns revealed about the circumstances of Lana Clarkson's death.
I'm not there to say this person is guilty. I'm here to say this is what the science says about this question on the case. I actually didn't know who he was, nor did I know who Lana Clarkson was. And it didn't matter to me. My science is my science, regardless of who the people are. Trace evidence is anything that can be found at a crime scene or a related scene to a crime or on a person, that you ask yourself, what is it and where did it come from? It's used to relate people and places in a time frame. It's things like hairs and fibers. It can be shoe prints, tire tracks, anything, pollen, soil, that can be used to link people and places. There is a specialty called bloodstain patterns. That actually is not technically part of trace evidence. It is a specialty of its own. I'm also trained in bloodstain patterns.
After 12 days of deliberations, 10 jurors voted guilty and 2 jurors voted not guilty. So I tried the first case in 2007. That was the case that was hung. We took a year off so that Phil Spector could get a new defense team. And we tried the second case in 2009. One visual that I will never forget, one tableau that will forever be burned in my mind, was going home that evening after the first jury had hung and the judge declared the mistrial. The one word that I never wanted to hear. I wanted a resolution. I thought Lana was entitled to a resolution of this case. I went home that evening and the nightly news had a shot from a helicopter looking down at Phil Spector's compound. He got out of his limousine and they showed him look up at the helicopter and shoot the middle finger to the helicopter and begin hugging his new bride. I interpreted that as disrespect to Lana. He might as well have been shooting the bird to Lana and saying to himself, see, Lana, celebrities can't be convicted in this town. I will get away with it just like everybody else in my position has gotten away with it for decades. I think he truly believed that. And that helped steel my resolve. I was not going to quit until we had a verdict.
In the days immediately after Lana Clarkson's death, on the Hollywood grapevine, there had been no suggestion of murder.
When I heard, first of all, that she had died at his house, because the first time I heard about it, it wasn't, murder yet. It was just something happened. A girl died at Phil Spector's house, that type of thing. So that was very unfortunate news, very sad. I didn't think anything of it more than, wow, someone OD'd at his house.
Phil had been gone so long from the music scene by then. He was this legendary, mysterious guy, and this dark cloud that just kind of kept getting bigger over the years, and then, there it went.
And then the details started to come out, how she was shot with Phil's gun. And then I thought, oh, this is really weird. This doesn't sound like Phil at all, because he wasn't that way. I mean, he wasn't a murderer.
With a murder charge hanging over him, Spector denied he'd admitted to his chauffeur that he had shot Lana Clarkson. Instead, his defense claimed Clarkson had pulled the trigger herself.
We now know what happened inside that foyer. Through the scientific evidence, we were able to recreate exactly what happened inside the house.
A bloodstain pattern analysis looks at patterns and amounts of blood, and depending on what has happened to the blood and where it comes from, you may be able to determine things like direction, like what caused it, a pool of blood versus spattered blood, gravity dripping of blood versus spattered blood. And if there is spatter, you can look at the shape of the drop and you can make a determination about the direction it came from, and you can do some measurements that may allow you to tell the angle that it impacted the particular surface it's on. Based on the physical evidence of my specialties, I could tell you where Lana Clarkson was at the time the gun discharged, where the gun was at the time it discharged, and where Phil Spector was at the time of discharge. And that was based on bloodstain pattern and other trace evidence.
We were able to reconstruct exactly what happened. And what happened was, at the end of having a drink or two with Phil Spector, she ultimately decided she wanted to leave. She walked over toward the back door, which is where she was let in. It's the only thing that she knew about the house. That's the ingress, that's the egress. So she gravitated over toward that back door. The back door was shut. She's now seated in a chair with her purse over her right shoulder. But interestingly, she's leaning back. As she's found by the police, she's leaning back, almost straight back, with her purse hooked over the arm of the chair. Her hips, though, are very much forward. They're right to the edge of the chair, uncomfortably close to the edge of the chair, as if she's about to get up or stand up, or if she's just sat down temporarily. She's not seated in a comfortable position, if that makes sense. Her hips are not back toward the back of the chair. They're way up toward the edge of the front of the chair. What did that tell us? Given the fact that her hips are situated toward the front of the chair, she's got her purse still on her shoulder, and she's 4 feet away from the back door, which is her only understanding of how to get out of the house. It was very clear that she was saying, "I'm ready to leave. I'm ready to go." We believe that he was making amorous passes at her. Those were not being responded to the way he liked it. So he pulled a .38 snub nose out of a drawer and decided to hold her there against her will. Ultimately, he walked up and pushed the gun toward her face and ultimately into her mouth. At some point, we believe that she began to fight him off and fight the gun off. And that's when the trigger was pulled, while the gun was still in her mouth as she's pushing back on his hand and he's leaning into her.
The gun was in her mouth in an upright position behind the front teeth, and the spatter on Phil Spector indicated that he was within 3 feet of the discharging gun. As the bloodstain pattern, I can't tell you he was holding the gun. I can't tell you that he was at 1 foot or 2 foot, but from the size of the small spatter, it only goes out about 3 feet.
He's wearing a big, oversized white jacket, and on that jacket was bloodstain evidence that established that he was within 2 feet. The jacket was within 2 feet of her mouth.
That jacket was found apparently on the 2nd story in a bedroom. Evidently, by the time I got to court, the defense had conceded that Phil Spector was wearing that jacket. So it was the defense's expert who actually put him within the arm's distance.
We also were able to establish, based on injuries to her wrists, that she was unable. She physically could not have turned that gun around and cranked it into her own mouth, even if she had wanted to, which was what the defense was postulating. They were suggesting that it was a self-inflicted intraoral gunshot wound.
There's some critical evidence to this case. And the question being, where were the 2 people and the gun at the time it discharged? Probably very significant was the gun on the back side of the forward sight had white material impacted on it. And that white material was dental enamel and ceramic. And Lana Clarkson had ceramic crowns on her front teeth, and one of her teeth had been broken. And the only way you can do that is to have the gun with the front sight behind the front teeth at the time of discharge. And what's important is it places the gun in an upright position. It wasn't in her mouth sideways. It wasn't in her mouth upside down. It was upright. And then that combined with information from the pathologist about where the bullet wounds were and the path puts that gun in a pretty precise position. So if you are going to commit suicide with a 2-inch revolver, how do you get it in your mouth in that position and pull the trigger? That's pretty limited because you can't hold a gun and wrench your hand around like that. So that combined with the bloodstain pattern information places the people and the gun at the chair location, because the pattern was on the chair at the time of discharge. Not on the step, not behind the chair, and it put her in the chair in a particular position, and actually even positioned her handbag at the time of the discharge because of where the pattern was on the chair and what areas were exposed or not exposed, and where the blood was on her clothing. So she's in a particular position in the chair.
So we put him within a 2-foot arc of her when the gun was actually shot, and we were able to establish that his right hand and his left hand were in front of him, not down by his side, but outstretched in front of him, exactly as it would be if he was pushing a gun and holding her wrist, pushing the gun into her face and into her mouth. Ultimately, with the gun going off and shooting the bullet through the back of her head and severing her spine.
After fatally shooting Lana Clarkson, Phil Spector went out of the back door of his mansion and, still carrying the gun, said to his chauffeur, "I think I killed somebody." D'Souza, who had been waiting patiently in the courtyard in anticipation of taking Lana Clarkson home, instead drove away in a panic and called police.
And then it was Phil Spector's conduct right after that fatal shot was fired that told the rest of the story. Instead of calling 911, 40 some odd minutes went by before the police actually arrived. And during that time, he changed his clothes. He tried to wipe her face off. He tried to hide the rag that he used to wipe her face off. He dunked that rag in the toilet, using toilet water to try to cover up the crime scene, probably in his mind trying to wipe the evidence away. He placed the gun under her left foot, even though that gun had his prints and his DNA on it. He took that white jacket that had all the bloodstain pattern evidence on it, turned it inside out and threw it upstairs, and ultimately completely tried to rid himself of any culpability or rid himself of liability by staging the crime scene.
There was evidence of activity after the gun discharged. There was a wet cloth with blood smears on it, and there was smeared blood on her face. I wouldn't be in a position to call that tampering as opposed to, oh my God, I have to help her. I can see that evidence of movement and activity afterwards. I don't put a judgment on it.
That was consciousness of guilt. If his story were true, he just watched a woman kill herself. The first thing he's going to do is run out and scream for help. He's going to run out and call the police. He's going to attempt to revive her. He did none of that. The jurors put all of that together and ultimately reached the right verdict, which was guilt beyond a reasonable doubt for the second-degree murder of Lana Clarkson. I can't say that there was one single moment in the trial where everything turned on that one piece of evidence, including Adriano D'Souza. Is it powerful that he got up on the witness stand and said, I heard him say, I think I killed somebody? Absolutely. There's no question that that was an unbelievably powerful moment in the trial. It was a powerful piece of evidence for us to propound. But that wasn't the single thing that changed anybody's mind. It was the combination, it was the totality of the evidence that we were able to present in a cogent and coherent way, I think, that was of convincing force for each of the jurors.
Despite the weight of evidence against Phil Spector and the details of Lana Clarkson's death, Michelle Rubini prefers to remember his qualities as an accomplished and sought-after music producer.
I think for the people that were not of his generation, perhaps it distracted from his accomplishments because they didn't know who Phil Spector was other than just a record producer that produced the Beatles or something like that. But for those of us who knew him and worked with him, this did not distract at all from his accomplishments or his talent or his genius in the recording studio.
I recognize that there's a genius, but I also recognize that there's a sociopath behind the genius who decided early on that his success was going to be measured by how much he could bully and intimidate other people, often women, and often people more vulnerable than he was, i.e., he had the guns and they didn't. I never believed that he pulled the gun out in order to shoot Lana Clarkson in the face. That was never our theory of the case. It's not what we argued to the jury. It's not what I believe as I sit here. I believe that he pulled the gun to bully her and intimidate her, and he wanted to stick that gun in her mouth to let her know who's boss. And when she leaned back, he pushed forward and squeezed, and that's when that loaded weapon went off and ended her life. That's, by definition, that is second-degree murder.
On April 13, 2009, more than 6 years after Clarkson was killed, a jury found Spector guilty of murder in the second degree. He was sentenced to 19 years to life in prison.
The Clarkson family is probably one of the strongest, most resilient families I've ever come across. I've learned over the years in dealing with families that it's a mistake to think, oh, well, if we just get this conviction and get the bad guy behind bars, that there's closure. There's absolutely no such thing as closure for the family. They will have a part of my heart for the rest of my life. I care very, very deeply for the Clarksons. I care very deeply for Lana. Over the years, I've tried dozens and dozens and dozens of murder cases, and I have exactly one photograph that I've kept from all of them, and that's a picture of Lana Clarkson that I've kept throughout the years and will probably keep forever, just as a reminder of the deep loss that we all have suffered at her murder and at the hands of Phil Spector, and he's the one that should have to live with that photograph. I have it, but he's the one that should be thinking about it. Lana Clarkson was simply the last of several women, any of whom could have lost their lives. Lana got the bullet. The others escaped with their lives, but not by much. It's such a sad circumstance that this could have been avoided if Phil Spector weren't so diabolical.